This is the first of several short pieces where I hope to discuss some ideas about the nature of Baroque architecture. Now, I'm discussing it because I happen to think that with genuine works of Baroque architecture, a type of space is created that doesn't really have an equivalence in other modes of architectural practice, at least in the Western tradition. I think it's kind of superior to the other ways in which we operate, with the exception perhaps of Gothic. Now, of course, outside of the Western tradition, we have the architecture of China and Japan and Scandinavia and Nepal and Mesoamerica and all of these other places, which in their own different ways, these traditions are absolutely sublime and equally a match of Baroque. So I'm not making a claim that it's in any way better. Now, architects these days, they seldom attempt to create buildings with a Baroque sensibility. And I happen to think that in its essentials, there is something about Baroque practice which we could go back to in order to make the spaces that we make these days a little bit better. Now, I'm not for any minute proposing that what we should do is create buildings that look like they come from 17th century Mexico City. Not at all. What I'm saying is we should go back with a critical eye and just examine what's going on with these buildings so that we can improve our own practice. Okay, so when we talk about Baroque architecture, the first thing we have to decide is, and it's not so easy to do, is what exactly do we mean, or what approximately do we mean? So let's have a look at some examples. In the broadest sense, we're talking about a mode of architectural activity which I personally happen to believe begins at Michelangelo around the 1540s, but which most commentators would say dates to 1580s Rome. Now, this way of work spread in a geographically quite limited way, but in a way that was often undiluted to other parts of the world. Architects continued to exercise in the Baroque fashion until at least 1750 and maybe beyond. So we're talking about buildings like these here in Rome and in Sicily and in Central and South America and other parts of Europe. And I'm just going to call attention to this little building here by Bernini. Actually, I don't want to call attention to the building. I want to call attention to Bernini. This is Santa Maria al Quirinale in Rome from the 1660s. But remember his name because we're going to come back to him in a minute. Now, why we say these buildings qualify as Baroque is something that we all differ on. Frequently, Baroque buildings are said to have elements that are in some way exaggerated in terms of scale or style, or to have very curved surfaces, or to be ostentatious or showy, or to have decorative carvings and fountains, or to be very busy or very fussy. That's generally what you read when you look at books, that examine the nature of Baroque. This is the kind of commentary that comes up again and again. But the truly Baroque works of architecture are linked not by stylistic elements or because they possess features from a sort of a predefined list. For me, they're defined by their capacity to stir an emotion or to provoke a sense of excitement or perhaps a sense of curiosity or perhaps a sense maybe even of intoxication. Now, for me, I'd go so far as to say that truly Baroque buildings, the ones that I find are the most successful, they have about them a sense of the erotic. And I mean that term not in the sexual reading that we would normally use, but in the sense that with the erotic there is a quickening of the pulse. Something happens quite suddenly and something is communicated very quickly and catches us off guard. I was trying to think of what might pass as an example for this kind of an idea of erotic, this reading of erotic. And I think maybe we've all been to the beach and we're going to go for a swim, and just before we see the big wave crash onto the beach, there is that sense of anticipation and excitement, which is sort of visceral. That might be where we're coming from. Okay, now, so with that in mind, let's just look at these two buildings here. These are the two famous churches in the Piazza del Popolo in Rome, Santa Maria de Miracoli and Santa Maria di Montesanto. Work on these churches began in the 1660s and continued for quite some time. Various different architects were involved, but we're not going to get into all of that right now. We're just going to look at these little buildings. And we will address head on the thing that everybody is thinking. and that is that these buildings look like they are identical twins. And there's absolutely nothing more Baroque in the whole wide world than identical twins. Nobody can resist the identical twin. We ask ourselves, are they absolutely identical? Is one of them smarter? Is one of them evil? Are they telepathic? Do they have weird secrets? Do they pretend to be each other, in public or with friends or with significant others and that kind of thing? Point here is that once we start to think along these lines, once this suggestion comes into our mind, we've entered into the world of the Baroque. Now, as it happens, these buildings are not identical, which is what makes them interesting, but that's a discussion for another day. If we limit it just to the example that I've just cited there, we might say, yeah, we're all on the same page. But frequently, like for example, if we Google Baroque architecture, we'll arrive at examples where we go, well, that's not quite the same thing as what your man is talking about. So for example, if you were to Google it, I'd say most likely the building that would come up in your search would be the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. It seems to me that some of the examples from Northern Europe, and Versailles probably is the best example, that we find some elements in the structure and in the interior and in the way it's built that are executed in a style which on the surface bears some kind of similarity to the work that we've seen in the previous Italian examples. So there might be fountains or carvings or cherubs or elaborations. But when I visit Versailles, I have to say that I don't have the same feeling. I don't feel like I'm in the same kind of architectural zone as the two churches that we saw in Piazza del Popolo just a few moments ago. Versailles is not a Baroque piece of work because it's not interested in being Baroque. It's interested in displaying power. Similarly, this building here, which is Blenheim Palace, just outside Oxford, I don't think it's Baroque. I think it's a building that is interested in communicating wealth. There's a tiny little bit of circumstantial evidence to back up the assertion that I've just made, which is essentially that there's a north-south split in Baroque architecture, that a gap exists. And the circumstantial evidence is this. Do you remember our friend Bernini that I asked you to remember his name there just a second ago? Well, at the time in the 1660s, he was the leading practitioner in the Baroque manner in Rome. And he was invited by Louis XIV, who was the most powerful monarch in Europe at the time, to come to Paris to design an extension for the Louvre. His arrival in 1665 was the social event of the season. It's very well recorded. There are lots of pieces that you can refer to that document his time in Paris. Essentially, he was hailed when he arrived, but as the months passed, it became quite clear that he wasn't getting on particularly well with Louis XIV. They didn't see eye to eye. Now, Bernini did come up with the design for the Louvre just as he was asked, but it was never executed. And if you read some of the popular texts that you'll find, they tend to sort of say, well, it was nothing to do with style, it was more to do with other things, cost and so on. However, it strikes me that that isn't quite the truth, because I think all you have to do is look at what Bernini proposed and what was ultimately built, which is this thing here. And I think we'd have to conclude that, yeah, there must have been an issue about style. So we're agreeing with one another here. Not all buildings that are said to be Baroque are actually Baroque. And we have clarified that issue for good and all. But there is another area of confusion about the use of the term Baroque that I want to mention, because you'll find that Baroque is a term that's also used to include a form of urban planning. Now, this type of urban planning arrangement, you'll note when you see it because it frequently involves very wide avenues running in very straight lines for very long distances, and often ending up in what we refer to as a trident or a trivium. So you'll have like a big avenue coming into a piazza or a square over here, and then two others coming in from an angle. And we've all visited cities where they have this kind of an arrangement, and this is often referred to as Baroque planning. I think this is an unfortunate application of the term because it just causes more confusion, because I think the spirit of this type of urban planning is very different from what we refer to as true Baroque in building. There are all sorts of explanations for why we refer to this type of urban planning as Baroque, but I think it's come about as an accident of association. Now, you will remember that we looked at these identical twins in the Piazza del Popolo. Well, these two buildings, their site was formed as a result of some planning works which are carried out in the area where they were built, but just prior to their construction. Essentially what happened was that it was decided to remove some of Rome's medieval buildings, some of the clutter, to make it easier for people to move through the city and get to important locations. As it happened in this case, we're talking about churches. And this whole exercise, this whole collection of works, when taken together, is frequently referred to as the Baroque replanning of Rome. So that this arrangement, this trident, this trivium I was talking about, which we see here arriving into the Piazza del Popolo, it's become synonymous with Baroque planning. And as we saw there with some of the slides that I went through, trivia, tridents, have been implemented in places like Karlsruhe and St. Petersburg, and also, as it happens, in Versailles. This is how the town outside the palace gates is laid out. And the town and its layout is as much a part of the story of Versailles as the palace itself, but it tends to get a little bit overlooked. It's only people like us who tend to pay attention to it. Now, another term is often used to describe this way of town planning, and that is grand manner. And I think to avoid confusion, it would make an awful lot of sense if we just used grand manner whenever we're talking about this arrangement. Now, I mentioned earlier that architects haven't really worked in a Baroque mode in recent times, not to any great extent anyway. But there are some examples that I think do come close. So I'll just mention a couple of them. This is Jørn Utsen's church in Denmark. And here's a house by the Argentine architect Emilio Ambas, which is in southern Spain. And then, of course, we have several of Zaha Hadid's buildings. This one in Baku in Azerbaijan, I think, is the closest she got to expressing a Baroque mentality. However, there are also some buildings which are cited in the same discussion as being in some way Baroque, and I think, for example, Frank Gehry's work in Bilbao, the Guggenheim Museum, would be top of the list. But I don't think that this building belongs in the same set as the other ones, like the Zaha Hadid building, because I think if we look at this building, I think and it's a very interesting building in all sorts of different ways, I just don't think that it's attempting to express a Baroque sensibility. I think what Gehry's doing here is he's more interested in creating an excitement about the future. There's a futurism about the building. Just because you have curves, that doesn't make you Baroque. But if you are Baroque, you may have some curves. Now, I'm not proposing that an entire architectural idea can be hung on the notion that two little buildings in Rome happen to look like identical twins. I think if you're going to make a proposal for something, that there is such a thing as a Baroque architecture and that it's important, there has to be more substance to it than that, and I'm going to try to attempt to develop that substance in the next couple of videos.